the Space Coast Progressive Alliance. My name's Dan McDowell, and I'm sitting in tonight for Phil Stasek, who is taking a well-deserved vacation. And we're pleased you're here tonight, and we have a great program. It's the Moms Demand Action, our violence in America, gun violence in America, myths and facts versus fact. And I will do my very best to try to keep the program running as smooth as possible. But since I have doing this on a part-time basis, just bear with me here. I have a wonderful group of colleagues that will jump in and save me, hopefully, if we get into a problem. We have tonight, we have, like I said, the Moms Demand Action, and we have, but before we go there, I wanted to make sure I introduce Raed, who is our chair of the Space Coast Progressive Alliance, to give the group some updates here very quickly, and then we'll get into the program.
Thank you, Daniel. I know you'll do well. You look great, as I said earlier, and we have no doubt. We have this August we have a great program, and I just want to welcome our membership and our audience who joined us today. Hopefully, we'll get a little more. I know people kind of get in and join slowly, but I expect a lot of people to attend. This is an important topic, and it's a nonpartisan topic, and we have wonderful leaders of Brevard County, leaders of, and they're volunteers with Moms Demands Action. We appreciate their time and giving us more educated answers to tonight's discussion. But before we start, I would like just to chip in a couple of words about Space Coast Progressive Alliance. We do have a great membership and would love to earn more of whoever is attending and not a member. It's only $25 a year. It's easy to apply. It's just go into our website, www.scpaflorida.com. You can contribute if you'd like more. If you contribute less, it's $25 per person, $35 for the family, and students. I think it's only $10. I know today's program was organized by Danielle and I appreciate that, and all the APC group, the Action Project Committee that we have, does every month does a great program, and can't wait to hear tonight's program, and we'll announce the future program at one point today. I know our treasurer is not in, so I'm filling in for her. With that, the only thing that I would ask the panel, and I'm sure Daniel will mention it, we would like to ask our panel to give us an action item, because these programs are important to get everybody educated, but it's also important to also follow up with an action item. And we're looking forward to the recommendation at one point during this session tonight. So thank you again, Danielle. Thank you for our panelists for joining us. Send it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairman. And welcome, everyone, if you just joined us. My name is Dan McDowell, and I will be moderating the program tonight for Moms Demand Action, Gun Violence in America, Myths versus Facts. And before I get started here, I want to mention a few items. One is that if you're new to this program, we have you on mute for right now, and there'll be an opportunity towards the end of the program to open it up for questions and answers. So in order to move the program, we make the decision early to just kind of keep everyone on mute. We also have the chat room not available until that time as well. We are recording this program as well as live streaming to Facebook. Facebook will also have the ability to ask questions, and that will be through the assistance of our technical director, DP. Okay, with that said, we have one more bit of housekeeping items before we start the program, and that is we take this time to ask the community if there are any candidates on the call here or on the Zoom. And if there are, you can have 1 minute to introduce yourself, make whatever comments you want, but we do limit it to 1 minute, and you're going to need to raise your hand because it'll be too hard for us to identify where you're at with this many people on the line. So do we have any candidates that are here that would like to introduce themselves?
Or any public announcement as well. Yes, thank you.
Candidates that are here? None? Okay. Well, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and go into the program. We do have a timekeeper with us. Larry, I'm glad you joined us. Thank you. And Larry will get more involved when we get into the question and answer to make sure that we move that process along because the program tonight is a little bit different. If you're used to our program, we do a 3 to 4 individuals that each have an allotment of time to speak. But tonight's going to be a little bit different. We're shaking things up and we're looking forward to it. So it's a trial and error, and Connie and team are going to do a little bit of Q&A amongst themselves and present that way. And I'll let Connie introduce her her panel. But before doing that, I'm going to just speak a little bit about, I'll let Connie as well speak to Moms Demand Action, but I want to tell you a little bit about Connie. And she is a proud 23-year veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard. See if I can get this right. You hold a master's in adult learning and human resources from Virginia Tech. You are now retired. I can't tell that you are retired, but you and Scott, your husband, provide emergency management consulting and training for industry and federal and state emergency responders in the U.S. and Canada. Connie is a proud mom of 3, and in the last 6 years, she has volunteered in Brevard for the school system to take stock in children, mentoring as an avid and math tutor, and coaches FIRST robotics and STEM clubs. Is that fair? Did I capture that correctly there?
It is. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Following the horrific, and I mean horrific, mass shootings in Parkland, Florida, back in February 2018, Connie volunteered for then what was newly formed chapter of Moms Demand Action here in Brevard County. She currently serves as the communications lead, working to advocate for gun safety. So please welcome Connie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. Appreciate that. They're doing STEM and robotics is kind of my one of my favorite things I like to do. So it's always cool to hear that in a bio too as well. So the topic tonight is gun violence, and I always, whenever we have these kind of conversations, I always like to throw out a couple of statistics just to kind of set the stage and get people thinking about what that means to us and what it means to America. So every day in America, 110 people are shot and killed by guns in America. Another 200 are wounded. It's that level of gun violence in our country is a uniquely American problem. They don't see that in other countries in the world. And our work, if any of you have had an opportunity to interact with members of Moms Demand locally, we get asked a lot by folks in our advocacy work. They worry that gun laws just don't work. And then we also hear that gun laws or gun safety is a violation of the Second Amendment. And interestingly enough, sometimes when we meet folks that are not necessarily pro-gun safety or pro-gun laws, they have some pretty interesting comebacks, and we hear the same ones over and over again. And if anybody has taken an opportunity to jump in the comments in a Florida Today article or chat with folks on social media, you'll hear those same ones back and back. So when we were talking about how to format this thing, we thought, I have people say, well, what do I say when somebody says one of these myths? How do I respond to that, right? And so that's what we're going to aim today, is try and give you some information, some good, I always say, to arm you with facts. That's kind of a little bit of a double entendre there, a little bit of a pun. But it's to arm you with facts to help you better have those conversations. Wow. So, for example, one of the very most common myths that we hear is the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And I would tell you that if more guns made us safer in the United States, we would be the safest country in the world. We have more guns in the United States than any other country. We have more guns than we have people. So it would stand to reason that we should be the safest, and we're not. The fact is that we are 25 times more likely to die from gun violence in the United States than any other of our peer nations. So think about that. We have a gun homicide rate that's 25 times higher than any other high-income country in the world, and that's significant. So going back to the myth, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I'll give you some stats. So there was several university studies, National Institute of Health data that was used, and what they found is during times of during a gunfight, if you will, that people successfully defended themselves in 1% of crimes. 1% of times when there was guns involved, in only 1% were people able to successfully defend themselves. Another statistic is actually a report, and we'll provide this link to you at the end of this conversation, is there was a study done by the FBI of 160 active shooter incidents. And what they found is that shooters were rarely stopped by a standby from anybody except for law enforcement. It was really, really rare. In fact, what they found is there was 4 times as many times shootings were stopped by unarmed civilians than they were by somebody with a gun. So that would stand to reason that, it's one of those logical fallacy things that is not true. There are more guns in the U.S. than there are people. States with higher rates of gun ownership have higher rates of gun violence. So again, more guns do not necessarily make us safer. And then more recently, and it's an unfortunate statistic to be able to explain to folks, but if you've been reading what happens in the paper with Uvalde, there was 376 law enforcement officers responded to the Uvalde incident. 376 people with guns responded to a shooter in a school in Uvalde, Texas. There was an hour of chaos where, in fact, good guys with a gun did not stop a bad guy with a gun before he shot and killed 19 children and killed 2 adults. So more guns create more opportunities for injury and death, not fewer. So that's an example of how you could respond to that very common myth that we hear thrown out. And that's what we're hoping to do today. So this evening, my friends, and I'm trying to do the Brady Bunch here, but MJ is next to me. MJ Waters is here. She's one of our newest volunteers with Moms Demand Action. And then I also have Jerry Smith is here. She is also one of our newer volunteers, and we've had some good discussions in the last couple of months. And so what they're gonna do is they've done their own research. They've come up with some of the more common myths that they've heard, and we're gonna have a bit of a debate. And our thought is if you guys get to witness this debate and this discussion and see how well I do, and hopefully you'll be able to glean some good information from this. And they are the most common myths that we hear. I would open it up at the end in the Q&A. If you have one that you hear pretty frequently, let's hear it, because I would love to know what it is and see how well we can formulate a response. I personally am a big fan of stats and data and university research. I know when Parkland happened, that was my response. The first thing I did was did a deep dive into what's the research say? Do more guns make us safer? So you will hear me. I tend to lean on that a lot. And so we will provide those reference links to you as well, because I think that if you find yourself to be an intellectually curious person, you're going to want to read it yourself. So for each one of these myths that we're going to provide to you, we're also going to give you links to be able to go do more reading towards the end if you want to learn more. And certainly we would welcome more questions too as well. So our hope is that you will take away these good points and it allow us to be stronger, because the biggest thing and the most important thing that we can do as community advocates is be willing to have a conversation. And if you don't feel comfortable with the topic, many of us are very comfortable talking about the environment. Many of us are very comfortable talking about the importance of the economy, or, you know, many of us can speak to the importance of healthcare, but gun violence is one of those really awkward, kind of frustrating topics that you don't always feel so comfortable. So our goal today is to give you that kind of information that'll allow you to be more comfortable, because if we have any hope of solving a problem, we got to be willing to have a conversation. And so that's what the folks here today, you're going to witness this conversation. You're going to see how well I can hold my own. I've been practicing and see how well we can respond to some of these myths. And hopefully you'll be able to take 2 or 3 of these myths with you and continue to be an advocate like we are. Because again, the more we talk about it, the better chance we have of solving these problems, this uniquely American crisis in our community. So with that, I'd like to do is go ahead and hand it over to MJ. What do you got for me?
Well, you mentioned the mass shootings at Parkland in Fort Lauderdale and the more recently in Uvalde. But I keep hearing and seeing arguments made that we need to arm teachers, because if we arm them in the classroom, then this will keep our children safer in schools than anything else we can do. And in fact, this week in the New York Times, there was a picture on the front page of a kindergarten teacher holding a gun in a classroom. Wow. So how would you respond to that?
So it is very timely. You know, kids are going back to school next week. I personally fielded a couple of text messages from some very nervous moms who've been homeschooling the last couple of years because of COVID, and they're very nervous about sending their kids back to school. To answer the question, arming teachers and staff. So here's the myth: arming teachers and staff will keep our kids safer in schools. And the answer to that is no. Statistically, arming teachers ignores the research that the presence of a gun actually increases the risk. And there's study after study after study that has presented that. School safety experts and law enforcement have all come out saying, look, that's not something we want to do. There's other ways that we can make our schools, you know, ensure that our schools are safe. Another data point for you, study that was done by the Department of Education and the Department of Justice shows that the children, and this is kind of a sad statistic if you think about it, but children are 50 times more likely to be shot away from school. So, you know, inversely, right, they're 50 times safer in school than they are anywhere else. Another statistic is that approximately 1% of all homicides among school-age children happen on school grounds. So 99% of homicides among children happen away from school grounds, right? Right after Parkland, there was a really, really good article that was published in the Washington Post. And I find myself referring to it a lot because I think especially when I'm talking to a nervous parent that is concerned about sending their kid back to school, there was a risk analyst that had looked at all of the shootings that had happened from the time of Columbine all the way to Parkland, and had done a risk analysis of that. And what he looked at is of the millions and millions of kids that attend school. And then you factor that against how many days a year that kids are in school. And the data point that he came out with, and this is pretty powerful, that the chance of, as horrific it is, I mean, when we see this stuff happen in the news, it's visceral. I mean, when we see and we hear and we turn on CNN and we hear about a school shooting, it reverberates through our whole community. It's horrible. With that said, the chances of a school shooting is 1 in 614 million. So think about that, 1 in 614 million. So school shootings are very rare. They drive an enormous amount of policy and laws, but they are very, very rare. And I myself have spoke at school board meetings, and I said we wouldn't drop our babies off on our doorstep, at your doorstep, if we didn't think they were safe. And locally here in Brevard, our Brevard School Board has done a lot to harden our schools. We've all seen it, particularly if you have kids and you've seen the fences go up and you've heard about the drills that they have to do. So our schools are pretty safe. you are much more likely to be shot at a grocery store. In fact, you are more likely to be shot at home. Most homicides happen in the home, and you're more likely to be shot in a restaurant. So, but to answer the myth, the fact is introducing more guns into the schools only increases that risk. Bottom line, bringing more guns into our schools will make them less safe. This is timely. We have school board elections coming up. I don't know if any of our school board candidates are online. Locally, we've advocated very fiercely, attended a lot of school board meetings, and to not allow teachers to be armed. A lot of people don't know this, but after Parkland, the law was passed that allowed staff to be armed. And then the following legislative session, they expand that legislation to allow teachers to be armed in Florida schools. What happened locally is local school boards said, yes, we have that as a law, but we're not going to allow that to happen. And that is because our school board protected that. So depending on who's on the school board, that could change. And so that's another invite to you to pay attention to who's running for election and what their stance is on arming teachers, because statistically we know that the risk goes up exponentially if teachers are armed in the classroom. We have, and I'll list this as an action item as we get to the end of this, but we have gun sense candidates running for school board. Kim Ho and Aaron Dunn are both running, and they have applied and have been awarded gun sense candidate of distinction, which means that if the issue does come up for our local school board, that they would vote against the idea of arming staff and teachers. Right now, we have SROs and school security specialists carrying guns, but we certainly don't want our guidance counselors and our cafeteria workers and our teachers and those folks carrying. And that depends on the local school board. So it's important.
Hey, this is Dan. I'm going to jump in just a couple times here to because folks will be joining us in the middle of the program. I just wanted to say, for those of us that are joining us, for those of you that are joining us, you're joining the Moms Demand Action, Gun Violence in America, hosted by Connie Rooke and her team. And she myths versus facts. And you are all going to have an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the program. So with that, I also want to take this opportunity. I failed to mention a very important announcement, and today is the U.S. Coast Guard's 232nd birthday. And I wanted to go ahead and make mention of that because in recognition of Connie and Scott and all those in the service. So we do appreciate all our members of the military in and out of service. So thank you for that. And thank you, Shannon, for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you. Okay, so that's and that was probably out of all the myths that we're going to present today, I probably put the most energy into the guns in schools one. I promise you I won't pontificate for an hour on each one after this, but it's important. It's very important. It's important to a lot of people right now. So now, Jerry, what do you got for me?
Hi, Connie. One of the comments that I hear all the time, and it always seems to make sense to me, is that criminals will always find a way to get a gun. Often, these criminals get their firearms through underground sales as a gift. They may have someone purchase it for them, or through theft from victims or from the scene of a crime. How do we respond to that?
So that's a big one. We hear that a lot too. Why even bother, right? So the myth is criminals will always find a way to get their hands on a gun. So why would we even bother having gun safety laws at all, right? I will tell you that laws like background checks. So we have a background check law, and since 1994, those laws have blocked more than 4 million gun sales to people that could not legally own guns. And that's significant. That's 4 million gun sales that would have happened had there not been a background check law. So, and those are 4 million people that could have turned around and used that gun in a crime. And yes, in any society, bad people will always figure out ways to do bad things. It's kind of it's the nature of our life, right? It's the nature of our world. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have laws, right? Since Sandy Hook, we've seen the passage of 350 gun safety laws. And we know we have specific data in every state where those laws have made a difference. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go through this program about specific examples, but those laws have made a difference. I think the pointing to the idea that criminals will always get gun also forgets to acknowledge that there's other areas of gun safety that we work towards that don't have anything to do with criminals. For an example, 60% of gun deaths is suicide. That's got nothing to do with background checks for criminals, right? So 60%, in Florida, it's 62% of gun deaths is suicide. So we've got a lot of work to do there. We're doing a lot of work, and there's been some new laws that have been passed in the last 3 or 4 years, but that's significant. Another thing is unintentional discharges by children, where a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old gets a hold of a gun that's left open in the house or in a car and accidentally shoots a sibling. So safe storage laws is another example of a gun safety law that would make a significant difference. And those unintentional discharges are 100% preventable. So yes, criminals will figure out a way to do criminal things, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have laws. And there's other areas of gun violence that we've had a lot of success in. So that's my response. So MJ, you're up. What do you got?
Yeah, so you talked about background checks. Now, didn't we just pass a great big law in Congress a couple months ago where now everybody has to have a background check?
Yes, it's a great law, but no, it did not. It did not encompass everybody. In a perfect world, I'd blow out the candle on my birthday cake, and we would all have universal background checks, which would be background checks at every point of sale in America. The law did expand it, and I'll tell you what that was specifically. But right now, before the law happened, background checks were only required for folks that purchased a gun at a federal licensed dealer. And so there, you hear the term Charleston loophole, or the Florida loophole, or the gun show loophole, or the online sales loophole. There were lots of loopholes to that. So somebody could go to a gun show and buy a gun. They can go to a yard sale and buy a gun. They can go to a flea market and buy a gun. They can go online and buy a gun. So there were lots of loopholes to that because, again, the only place you could buy a gun is if you bought it from a federally licensed dealer. And I'm amazed at how many times we have conversations with people and they're like, really? I thought that we already had it. So that's a good point to remember, particularly when you're talking to someone. The new law that was just signed in June expanded that just a little bit. And it actually expanded it from just federal licensed dealers to those folks that are engaged in the business of selling guns. So if you're at a flea market and you're selling, gummy bears, and then like 90% of your sales is guns, then you probably should be running background checks. And so that allows us, and gun shows is another example. Online sales, if you have an online store and you're selling, and most of what you're selling is guns, then you have to do a background check. And so we should see some big changes in the data going forward on this. But that was a big deal. It's not ideal. Universal is what we want. I will tell you, and this is another good stat, is that 93% of Americans across the board, 93%, American voters support requiring background checks on non-gun sales. And to drill down on that statistic, 89% of Republicans and 89% of gun owners agree that we should have background checks on gun sales. So it's another one of those, what are we waiting for, right? It just goes to point to the fact that the gun lobby has a very strong hold on our legislative process, but it is a big deal. And what would happen is if we passed a law that required universal background checks, like if I wanted to sell a gun to Dan, what Dan and I would have to do is go to a gun dealer or someplace that could do, and we would conduct our sale with the gun dealer. So, and the gun dealer would run a background check, which is pretty easy and simple, and we pay him $10 to do that. And then I would be comfortable selling him a gun, knowing that he passed a gun background check, and then there would be a record of the sale. And folks would say, "Oh, that's onerous," and To back that up, 99% of people in America live within 10 miles of a gun store. There are 59,000 gun dealers in the United States. There are 4 times as many gun stores as there is McDonald's. We have more gun stores in Brevard County than we have Starbucks. So tell me again how the idea that you would conduct a sale at a gun store would be onerous, because if you can go to Starbucks or if you can go to McDonald's, you could do this and it would not be onerous, and it would increase the safety in our community. So there's your data point on that.
And didn't they expand background checks for people under the age of 21?
They did. So yes, there used to be some, and a lot that came directly out of Uvalde. And if you think about Parkland, Uvalde, the kids that did these mass shootings were young. And so now it requires a much deeper dive into criminal background check, but also mental health background check, and not, yes. And in order to be able to purchase a gun, you had to, if you were under 21, it becomes a much more strenuous. I will also mention that because of Uvalde, the law that was passed at the federal level is the first time that we've had a federal gun safety law in 26 years. So it took Parkland and Columbine and Sandy Hook and Uvalde and Buffalo, right? Think about it, to get to the point where we were actually able to pass a gun law at a federal level in 26 years. It wasn't perfect, but it was a big success for a lot of folks, particularly those in the trenches that have been working towards this for years. Thank you, MJ. Okay, Jerry, what do you got?
Well, there's been a lot of chatter about red flag laws, how they're used to take away guns from law-abiding citizens without any evidence or due process. That doesn't seem like a very fair law, and isn't it a violation of the Second Amendment?
Yes. So red flag laws, the federal legislation that I just mentioned that was just passed, what it did is it provided more money to the states that have red flag laws, because not every state in the country has it. There is no federal red flag law. And it allowed for more incentives for states that don't have red flag laws. For those of you that don't know, a red flag law, also called emergency risk protection order, basically allows law enforcement or a family member who recognizes that somebody is a danger to themselves or potentially a danger to somebody else to go in and temporarily remove guns from the home. Jerry mentioned the word due process. There's a notion out there among the gun lobby that it's going to allow police just to say, I don't think that guy's a safe person. I can just walk in and take all their guns away. And that's not the case at all. In fact, it is a tough process. I was doing a little research the last couple of days. In Florida, the paperwork is 12 pages long of information that has to be completed and what would happen. And in fact, in Florida, only a police officer can do it. In some other states, it's a police officer or a family member. But in Florida, a police officer would have, just like they would get a warrant for an arrest or a protection order, and they would have to complete an investigation, everything from how many guns were in the home, how much ammo is, and then specific instances where this person has given specific instances of where they express danger to themselves or a danger to somebody else. And then they have to go to a judge and request an order. And then the person whose guns are removed goes before the judge and pleads their case before it actually becomes permanent. So initially it's temporary and then it becomes permanent. And then only a judge can issue a permanent red flag order. They call it, you'll hear police officers and sheriffs in some of the counties in Florida or even nationwide that'll tell you, they call it the cooling off period. It does allow time for folks to be able to take a breather and figure out whether or not they are a risk. They are effective. Connecticut was one of the first states in the United States that passed a red flag law. And in the years following that, they saw a 14% reduction in suicide by firearms. That's significant. That's 14% reduction in suicide by firearms following the passage of that law. And what they've done is they've gone back and they've done reviews of cases like Parkland and Buffalo and Uvalde. And what they found is that the shooters exhibited specific warning signs that would have warranted an ERPO. So it's one of those unfortunate Monday morning quarterback. What could have we done to make sure this didn't happen? And it definitely, in El Paso, the shooter in El Paso in the Walmart that happened a year ago or 2 years ago, his mother had gone to the police twice and said, my kid's at risk. He's demonstrating some really bad behavior, and they didn't have any power to do anything. And it would have prevented the El Paso shooting. So since Parkland, 16,617. So over 16,000 ERPOs have been issued. In the state of Florida, we've seen over 8,000. And when I see data like that, I think, wow, that's 8,000 times where somebody was either a danger to themselves or a danger to somebody else, and we stopped, or whatever could have happened, even if it was just for a week or two, until the situation was stabilized. Going back to the Second Amendment, my one line that I use a lot, any of you have interacted with me, one of the things that I will always tell people, that it's important to support the Second Amendment. I think that we can support the Second Amendment, but we can also recognize there are some people that should not have access to guns. And when I tell that to folks, even folks that are the most ardent, pro-gun folks, when I say that, 99% of the time I get nods. People, yes, absolutely. There's some people that should not have access to guns. And I go, there you go. You can support the Second Amendment, but still recognize that not everybody should have a gun. Okay, MJ, what do you got?
Oh, this is one of my favorites. You hear this a lot. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I know when I first started doing this, my response was to shrug my shoulders, roll my eyes, and walk away. And I know that's not the most mature of responses, but yeah, it's a tough one. And when I hear the term guns don't kill people, people kill people. And now I think, yes, that, the same could be said for cars. The same could be said for prescription drugs. The same could be said for cigarettes, right? But we regulate them, right? So again, 110 people every day die in the United States by gun violence. Another 200 are wounded. Firearms are the number one cause of death for children and teens in America. And that 3-4 years ago, it was cars, right? And when we were kids, right? And before we had seatbelts and car seats, and we regulated them, and now it's guns. So the number one cause of death for children and teens in America is guns. So yes, guns don't kill people. People with guns kill people, and much more efficient than people without guns. So yes, that's a tough one. But again, it's important to have the conversation. So I wouldn't advise anybody here to roll their eyes and walk away. If they hear that, take it as an opportunity to remind folks that there are dangerous things in our world, and that, yes, we do regulate them.
Connie, before you get to your final myth versus fact, I have to jump in here for a quick public announcement.
Okay.
And make sure that the folks that have come on maybe a little later in the program here know that we will follow this panel discussion with a Q&A process, and we'll open that up to raising your hand. So start thinking of your questions for Connie and her volunteers from Moms Demand Action. We also have, as Connie mentioned, we'll be giving some links that Scott will be on, and entering that into the chat rooms when we open that back up. I do want to say that next program in September, I want to talk about that. So please stay with us, and we'll talk about the Florida censorship and obstructing our education for our September program. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Back to you, Connie.
Cool. Thank you. So I think that we're back to Jerry. So what do you have for me?
Well, this is one that I've heard quite a bit too. Strong gun laws don't work. Look at Chicago. Chicago has a lot of gun laws, but daily we read about shootings there. And I saw references to a study that said homicide rates tend to rise when law-abiding citizens can't own and carry firearms for self-defense. Is that true?
So two things there. And it's good that you mentioned studies that have been published or pushed out by the NRA. There are a few of those out there. I myself read them and believed them until I did a deeper dive. And the answer to that is no. Chicago actually is a prime example of why it doesn't matter how strict a gun law is in a certain city or a certain state. If the neighboring city or the neighboring state doesn't have a gun law, there's an impact there, right? Many of the guns used in Chicago in crime are traced back to nearby states with weaker laws. And I'll give you some very specific examples. So Indiana is right next to Illinois. It's actually the #1 source of guns that are used in Cook County, which is where Chicago is located. There was a study done in 2017 where they analyzed 4 years worth of gun tracing data to figure out guns used in crimes, where they come from. And what they found is that 60% of the guns used in crimes in Chicago had come from out of state. And the others, they had no tracking on them. A lot of them, we had no tracking on them. So Indiana was the primary source for 1 in 5 of those guns. And in 95% of those cases, the person who had that gun, the person who was arrested, was not the initial purchaser of that gun. Private gun sales in Indiana do not require a background check. There is no waiting period in Indiana, or Indiana does not require a record of the transaction. So Chicago, they have very strict gun laws, but what they've inherited is the weak gun laws around them. And then, Chicago's not the only one. I hear the same statistics with Baltimore or even Detroit, and I will grant you, yes, those cities have very unacceptable rates of gun homicide. But what I would also mention to you is that they are not the highest in the country. And I recently, and this is really good information. One of the sites that I go to a lot for data just recently updated a really great database. And what they've done is they've built this table where it shows a ranking of states by how strict their gun laws are, by how many gun laws they have. So, what state's #1, what state's, all the way through 50. And then they transpose right next to it the average gun violence rate. So deaths per 100,000 people. And I was looking at it yesterday, and I'll give you a couple of data points that speak specifically to Chicago, and then I'll tell you about nationwide. So Illinois, where Chicago is located, is ranked #6 in the country for strength of gun laws, which as a state, that's pretty phenomenal, and given that Chicago's there. So they're 6th in the country for gun law strength. And they have an average, and when you're talking about gun death, it's hard to use the word average, but they have an average gun violence rate of 14.1 per 100,000 residents. So for every 100,000 residents, there are 14.1 gun deaths. Now, Indiana, next door, right, is ranked 25th in the country for gun safety laws. Their gun violence rate is actually higher than Illinois. It's 17.3. So there are more gun deaths in Indiana than there are in Illinois. And it's correlated with their gun safety laws. People point to the big cities, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, LA. That must be where all the gun deaths are happening, right? The state that has the weakest gun laws in the nation is Mississippi. And it also has the highest gun violence rate in the country. So they're ranked 50th in the nation for gun safety laws, and they are also ranked the highest. So they have 28.6, almost double, right? 28.6 deaths per 100,000 people. So there is, and folks, the reason we see what happens in New York and Chicago and in Boston is because that's what's on the news. It is not necessarily indicative of what's really happening in the community. California is one of the largest states in the country, has one of the highest, if it's not the highest, it's the second highest population in the country. They are ranked #1 in the nation for gun law strength. They are ranked #2 for gun violence rates. So they only see, think about it, they have LA, San Francisco, San Diego, major large urban areas that are not immune to crime. Their gun violence rate is 8.5 per 100,000. And gun, you know, and we'll provide the link in here, but I think it's important to note. And for those of you who are curious, Florida, we're 19th in the nation. A lot of that is because of the laws that were passed right after Parkland. We did not have a red flag law in Florida. We did, our age to buy a gun in Florida was 18. It is now 21. Our law, we are ranked 19th in the nation, and our gun violence rate is 13.7. So, we'll provide that link to you. And I think it's interesting. So people make that judgment call that just because you live in a big city that has a lot of crime, that your gun violence rate must be higher, and it's not. Mississippi actually is one of the lowest. So, okay, well, those are the 7 biggest myths that we have. We can certainly share a few. I'd be really curious to see what we have in the comments. But what I'd like to do now is kind of, given that MJ is one of our newer volunteers with Moms Demand, I asked her to kind of give her thoughts on what it was like to navigate through this. And MJ, if you could.
Yeah, so I have felt pretty deeply about the need for more gun safety for many years, but I was really hesitant to engage because I felt like I didn't know enough. I have a longtime friend who's probably 30, 40 years ago, her teenage son killed himself with a gun. And as we call that, suicide by gun.
Right.
And she's never gotten over that. And, you know, just to see that personal devastation. And through this organization, we meet so many families who have dealt with this. So I met Connie and her tribe of Moms Demand Action, and then ended up, along with Jerry, we did a 2-day gun safety university to learn more about these issues. And I now feel better prepared to talk about this. I also feel like there's so much more to learn, but I would encourage everybody here who cares about this issue to, you know, learn more about it. I think this kind of thing with the Q&A can be very helpful. I've had a chance to try it out, and nobody has slapped me or run away at this point. Because I find if you know at least a little basic information, that it really is easy to talk about this topic with other people. And most people will agree that we need laws to keep our communities safe and more secure. And nobody agrees with that more than police officers and gun owners. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dan.
Thank you, MJ and Connie and Jerry and Scott. And we have opened the chat. So you should be able to put your questions in chat or raise your hand if you're on Zoom. If you're on Facebook, we encourage you to put your question through that system, and DP will represent the folks on Facebook. So with that said, not monitoring the chat, so I'm not sure if anything's coming through, but we have a hand up. Oh, actually, we have a candidate for our U.S. Congressional aide. So I will, oh, good, you're taking off the mute. Good. Go ahead there. Introduce yourself.
Everybody. It's Danelle Dodge, and I am running for Florida's 8th Congressional District. It's good to see Connie here. Happy anniversary of the Coast Guard. And also, I am also a Moms Demand Action Gun Sense candidate of distinction. And I really have appreciated Connie and Moms Demand Action for providing us with these conversation points, because we go to these different events and people ask these very questions that she had mentioned. I do want to let the group know too that on Monday, I did get an endorsement from the Progressives for Democracy in America. This is the Space Coast Progressives, so I'll let you all know that. And my question for Connie is, as they're trying to pass constitutional carry in Florida, are there any action items that we could be doing to try to keep that from happening?
Yeah, so constitutional carry is a marketing term for permitless carry, and fortunately we've been pretty good. I mean, every year, every legislative session in Florida, this comes up, and most recently, Governor DeSantis has indicated that if it was passed in the legislation, he would sign it. And basically, constitutional carry, permitless carry, which is really the correct term for it, would allow anyone in the state of Florida to carry a gun without a license, without a background check, and across the board. Everyone from law enforcement to community members have said, and especially Moms Demand too, as well, has said that this will make our communities less safe.
Is it also concealed carry?
It is not concealed carry. That
Okay.
We have laws for concealed carry, but in order to conceal carry, you still have to do safety training. You still have to get a permit.
Okay.
You still have to get a background check to purchase the gun. Constitutional carry basically would turn us into the wild west, unfortunately. And that there are laws about who is not allowed to own a gun. So convicted felons, domestic abusers, constitutional carry would basically remove all of that. And I've personally have talked to police officers and chiefs of police in our community that said that it'll do nothing but make their job harder. They can't hold folks accountable if we remove those kind of lines. I actually wrote an opinion piece that was published in Florida Today about that. And I was thankful that at the time we thought for sure it was going to end up in the legislature, but they ended up focusing on some other stuff. But there's nothing to say that it won't come up again. So all the more reason to be mindful of who you're sending to Tallahassee, and be prepared when the issue does come up. Every time it has come up, we've been pretty strong about going and writing and sending emails and letting our legislators know in Tallahassee that we don't want that in our community. Constitutional carry sounds cute and fun and fancy, but it's not. It's permitless carry, and we don't want that in our community. So I appreciate the question, Janelle.
Can I jump in on that, Connie?
Sure.
Yeah.
We heard the senator from Connecticut speak at the national gun program that we went to, Representative Chris somebody.
Yes.
And he said,
Chris Murphy.
And he said, I have been in Congress a long time and I haven't gotten any better at negotiating with my colleagues. And he was part of that very small bipartisan group that came together right after Uvalde. And he said, the reason that gun safety legislation got passed was not because of me or not because of any of the other senators, but it was because we heard from so many people in our hometowns that we had to do something. It was past time. People were very upset. And don't ever think that your voice doesn't make a difference. This was the first time that the voices rose to that level. And I really took that to heart because I think so many times I feel like, oh, I'm going to send another email. Is anybody even going to pay attention? But it does make a difference. So, you can feel that you have that personal power and join it with everybody else, and we can make a difference.
Great.
MJ, do you remember what the number was? How many phone calls were sent into the switchboard in DC?
It was over 1 million. In the 2 months prior, in between Uvalde when they took the vote, over 1 million.
Yeah, that campaign was called "Shut Down the Switchboard," and it was powerful.
Thank you. I just want to jump in here for a moment, and for those of you joining us, Moms Demand Action is discussing gun violence in America, myths versus facts. And I want to emphasize that nowhere in our presentation are we suggesting any changes to our amendment number 2, and feel very strong about this is about safety. And so I do encourage those of you on Facebook to submit any questions. Daniel will make sure your questions are brought through, and the chat room is open. I believe the links have been submitted. And there was another question. But before I get to the questions that are out there, let's go. I think Brad has a question.
Thank you. I just want to thank also again Connie's, Scott, MJ, and Jerry for putting the time today. And at the same time, on behalf of Space Coast Progressive Alliance, I want to also recognize, 3 years ago this week, we have lost lives of 23 people in El Paso, Texas. It was 3 years ago this week, due to hate, violence by mass shooting. 23 people lost their lives. And the second day or following couple of days later, also we had a mass shooting also in Ohio, if I recall, 9 people also lost their lives due to gun violence. So hopefully today we'll hear some action items that can honor the lives of these people that lost their lives. My question to Connie and the group, and I don't know if it's a myth or a fact, the federal law gives the gun industry legal protection that aren't afforded to other industries, shielding them from being accountable. Is that a myth or is it a fact? And if it's a fact, why our law, in Congress, why aren't they challenging this on both sides of the aisle?
So unfortunately, yes, it is a fact. And it baffles me every time I hear about that. The idea that a certain industry would be granted immunity from being sued, basically. I mean, if you can sue McDonald's because the cup of coffee they gave you was too hot and you spilled it in your own lap, but you can't sue the gun industry or hold them, the gun industry can't be held accountable. With that said, there have been recent cases. I don't know if any of you have seen, but Remington was sued by a families from Newtown, Connecticut, because, and there were some really good news articles that came out following that, but basically they were able to, in the court, explain how they were advertising these guns and they were targeting young men in their guns about how if you own a gun, here's your man card, you're more macho, you'll be cooler. And they were able to use that in their case against Remington, and they won. And we're talking millions and millions of dollars in that lawsuit. And a lot of that money is going to be spent towards gun safety efforts. Alex Jones is on trial right now because he said that Sandy Hook never happened, and he's being held accountable too. But I'm shocked that we still have a federal law. And there are a lot of, there's lots of things we want to do in Washington, D.C., but that's one of them that's on our list. The idea that we would have a federal law on the books that does not allow us to hold an industry accountable, particularly with their marketing. You can't blame somebody. You can't blame an industry for having a product and somebody buys it. But when you market that product in such a way where you encourage them to behave irresponsibly, or in such a way that they will cause other people to be in danger, yes, you do have to be held accountable. But yes, that is true. Unfortunately, it is not a myth. And it is certainly more reason to vote and send the right people to Washington to try and repeal that law.
Thank you, Connie. We have a couple other questions coming through the chat. One is, what is the status of domestic abuses being able to own to be able to own guns?
So for years and years, if somebody was a convicted domestic abuser, they were not allowed to purchase a gun, but the definition of those domestic abusers was somebody that you were married with or somebody that you cohabitated with or you had children with. And you remember earlier in the program, I talked about loopholes, right? So loopholes with background checks. There was a term called the boyfriend loophole. And we personally, there's one of our local volunteers here, her daughter Angel was shot and killed by her boyfriend. And he was able to obtain a gun, even though he shouldn't have had one. He had a history. In fact, he had been married before, and his wife had restraining orders against him, and he should not have been able to have a gun. But unfortunately, he was shot. The new federal law that was just passed in June closed the boyfriend loophole, and that was particularly for folks that focus on gun safety legislation. The idea of domestic violence is a big deal. So that was big, the boyfriend loophole. So yes, domestic violence. In fact, in October, Moms Demand Action, that's one of our months that we do stuff. We've collected toiletry items and donated them to women's shelters. So that's another example of where we can do support and advocacy in our community. But the boyfriend loophole at a federal level has been closed.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Shannon, who's asked, what sensitivity training, if any, is being given to the law enforcement, given the propensity many of them have to use guns to apprehend non-white individuals rather than more peaceful, humane means to detain them. Wow,
So
that's a
it
big
is.
one.
That's a huge question. Yes. I can give you the quick answer, but I will tell you that there's a lot of really good information. If you go to every town, and Scott can probably find a couple of the links, but yes, following the George Floyd, our organization as a whole nationwide made a commitment to recognize that gun violence impacts communities of color, African Americans, and Hispanics much more. Statistically, it's shocking how much more they're impacted by gun violence and police bias. And so we've done a lot more outreach in that area. We've done a lot more research in that area. Even here locally, I know Reed and I participated in some panels where we were able to question the chiefs of police and ask them what they were doing to reduce bias within the community. Everything from police departments investing in cameras to doing awareness training amongst their staff and requiring it on a regular basis, to evaluating when an arrest is made, having a third party within the organization evaluating the decisions made for those arrests. So there absolutely are steps that can be taken to recognize. So that's a great question, Shannon. And there's a lot of good information, good solid information out there about how individually police departments can do to ensure that that doesn't happen in our case. We're not immune from it, but there are things that we can do to be better about it. I know even here locally in Brevard, we've had these conversations with our police departments to ask them to move in that direction. And they've been very forthcoming and they've been very open to that because they recognize that they don't want to be one of those communities that is
Right.
ends up on CNN, right? Or disappoints or loses the trust of their community.
The one thing I will mention though, as far as the sensitivity training, that when we look at budget issues, we talk about elections matter.
This is Daniel. Who's speaking?
Scott.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Scott.
One of the issues is that the police departments are short officers already. I know Palm Bay was something like 20 officers short. Cocoa is a dozen short. So you're already short officers, and then there's a lack of money to pay for training, and then the time commitment. So those three things can create issues as far as whether that sensitivity training is actually done. I know they have talked about trying to incorporate that into some of the academies. So like, I believe Eastern Florida offers a course on that for folks that are going through the police academy there. But it's nice to say that it's going to happen, but it may or may not, depending upon what the external factors are on that.
Thank you, Scott. There is
Dan?
Sure.
At the Moms Demand Action national seminar, there's a group called the Policing Project that specifically focuses on this issue. And one of the things, Shannon, you might want to check into that they talked about was taking so many of these issues happened at a routine traffic stop. And there are many times, like let's just say something's wrong with your tag on your car, where the officer could just take a picture of your license plate, send that in, and then they could send you a ticket in the mail, where there doesn't need to even be a physical interaction. And they are focusing on some of those issues that actually could be turned very violent against the police officer, where they could just resolve this by not even having any kind of physical confrontation. And they're specifically working with things that we're talking about here to make it safer for everybody, not just the citizens, the police as well. And because we don't always need to have that. You know, look at how many of those, it was a traffic stop and somebody ended up getting shot, which is just unimaginable to most of us.
Thank you, MJ. We do have a couple of follow-ups. I think candidate Dodge had a comment and follow-up item, as well as Shannon. Do you mind sharing your question there, Candidate Dodge?
Sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's definitely on my list to do what Connie was talking about. And now I can't even remember what it was because I'm lost my mind, but to get that overturned, as well as digitizing the ATF record keeping of guns used in crimes. Is that correct, Connie, that they still have to do all of that on paper?
They do. And the new law that was just passed actually provided some funding for that. But yes, in the interstate, there was never a law against buying guns in one state and then selling them in another state, and the new law allows for that. But a lot of that is just having the database and the mechanism to be able to track gun sales. So there is now funding for the Department of Justice and ATF to be able to do that. So I suspect we're going to see a lot of improvement in that forum with those things. I'm watching it closely.
And Moms Demand Action, you talk about how you support the Second Amendment, but what are your guys' feelings on the assault weapons ban issue?
So we are a very, what's the word I'm looking for? We love our guns in America. The idea that we're going to be able to ban anything is just not feasible. We can regulate, right? And there's certain people that can own them. High capacity magazines is another example. I mean, it's one thing to be able to go to the range and be able to go shoot your gun, but you do not need a high capacity magazine. So when you see some of the verbiage, particularly from Moms Demand Action and Everytown and Giffords and Brady, very rarely will they say high capacity ban. I do know that there's a bill that was just passed the House in Washington, D.C., and it's making its way to the Senate. Whether or not it'll be heard, I personally don't see it happening. It's a good effort, but I do think that they do need to be regulated. And I know Scott dropped a link in there about what the stance is from our organization. I know a lot of folks that own guns and they love their guns and they're very, very safe. And so the idea that we're going to go around and kick down everyone's door and take their guns away from them is just not feasible. How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Or the other line is, how do you win? You only pick the battles that you can win. This is one of those battles that we need to be very careful about how we approach it. So regulation of high capacity magazines and regulation of assault weapons is definitely something that's doable.
Great. Thank you, Connie. Larry, before we get to your question, because I see you have your hand up, there is a follow-up with Shannon. I'd like to jump in here just for a second. And Shannon writes, is Florida now using mental health professionals to accompany the law enforcement in cases where a mental health related disturbance is reported?
So that is not something that's been funded and allowed for. I know that in some jurisdictions locally, like in Miami and Tampa, it's a funding issue, right? They know that a lot of domestic disturbance incidents or just calls for assistance, the police will tell you the idea of being able to have a social worker or a mental health professional with them when they make those calls, that it actually resolves much faster. But again, if the communities aren't funded and staffed to be able to do that, then it's not going to happen. Other cities, there's some great examples in LA where they've done that, and in San Francisco where they've staffed up the police department with mental health professionals. And when you hear the terms like defund police, it's not defund the police, it's to be able to bring in additional staffing and support. So this is an example of where money like that is actually used to help the police resolve a domestic violence incident much faster, or a call out or a crisis or a suicide, by allowing other professionals in the community to assist the police departments. But again, it comes down to funding, money, and staffing. It's a great question, Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Let's go to Larry, but we do have another question after Larry that I need to ask. Thank you. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, well, my question was about assault weapons. You've answered some of that, but have you looked, at the studies of what countries like Canada, UK, Australia have done with banning new purchase of assault weapons and buying them back? And also, have you looked at the studies of what happened before our ban on semi-automatic weapons and after? So I know that maybe strategically you don't want to do that now. The President Biden, however, let's mention desire. He may not think
Yes.
it could happen. So it's I see people in countries that have to use knives to try to kill people or make their own gun and stuff like that. And I think about how many more people these 18-year-olds can kill with semi-automatic weapons. So
Oh, I know. Yes.
again,
Yeah, and in Australia in fact, there's been some I watched a documentary about what they did in Australia. So there was a shooting, a mass shooting in Australia that was very significant. It was 30, 40 people were killed, and the country as a whole within a month passed these swooping laws and asked people to turn their guns in, and they had a massive gun buyback program. And basically, and there are plenty of people in Australia that own guns, but they're sheep farmers and ranchers, and they use them to shoot snakes on their property. They don't use them to hang them in their office because they think they're fun and they're cool. And then statistics on the number of gun deaths is phenomenal in Australia. It took a lot of my old boss used to call it intestinal fortitude. Right, a lot of guts for a country to take on something that strong, and I've heard President Biden use those terms, but you will find that he doesn't say ban assault weapons. He says regulate assault weapons, and I think that we can get there. And I think that a lot of people believe that we should get there. And yes, I have seen the numbers, and they're pretty amazing. We had an assault weapons ban for years, and when it expired, we saw a significant uptick in deaths. So. If it makes it through the Senate, I'll be the first one to celebrate for sure. Absolutely. Am I going to spend what time and energy I have pursuing it when I can pursue getting gun sense candidates elected or pushing for background checks or better health, mental health support and suicide awareness on the gamut of the 50 things that I'd love to see happen? It's on there, but it's not my biggest challenge right now.
Excellent.
So thank you, Charlie.
very quickly, what do you mean by regulate?
So regulate would be who's allowed to purchase one. And if you do purchase one, it has to be registered. And when you do purchase one, what kind of background check are you allowed to have? And if you do purchase one, are you going to be allowed to have a high capacity magazine to go along with it? So that kind of thing. So regulate who's allowed to have them, and do we require safe storage? If you live in a home where there's kids, do we require you to lock it up? Because the statistics, most school shootings, most instances when a kid brings a gun to school, it's like 70-80% that kid brought it from home. So if you insist on having an assault weapon, are we going to require you to have it locked up? So that's an example of where you would regulate it.
Great. Thank you, Connie. And I do, Charlie did get his answer from Scott online. So thank you, Scott, for doing that. And I'm going to take this opportunity to say that his question was wanting to know more stats. And Scott references a couple of links. So I encourage you to go out to the chat. But if you're not able to, the links were www.everytown.org and giffords.org. So you want to take advantage and look at those two sites as well. And let's see, is Daniel, has everyone been answered their questions on Facebook or any comments from Facebook group?
I haven't received any questions on Facebook yet.
Okay, that means the Zoomers are doing a great job of getting those questions out there, and the Moms Demand Action team is providing the answers. So we have a little more time before we have to wrap things up and talk about action items. Is there anybody else that would like to comment?
I would just add, and I put this in the chat, that Shannon asked about mental health members of police stations. The city of Palm Bay has had a domestic violence police officer for, I think, about 20 years. And often when they get a call, they will...
a card for anniversary.
Sorry about that. I put him on mute. You're okay.
Oh, that oftentimes when they get a call, she will talk with the police officer, and sometimes they realize that just that mental health professional needs to go and deal with it. And other times she goes along with the officer, because officers, one of the highest risk situations they have is when they go to a domestic violence issue involving a weapon. It's very unsafe for them as well.
Excellent. Thank you, MJ. I see, Daniel, you have met your quota for tonight. You get 3. So go for it, Daniel. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, I got to do, sorry about that. Go ahead and do it now. There you go.
Okay, I didn't know if you're talking to me. My name's Danielle, but anyway.
Danielle. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I get called your name all the time. So sorry about that.
One of the things I am working on is to try to go on a ride along with the Titusville police. And so I'm really interested to talk to them directly and get their take on what's going on in Titusville and the gun safety issues there. And then just as a reminder, they've mentioned about voting in the questions. And I just want to remind everybody that you can still get a mail-in ballot until August 13th. That early voting is August 13th to the 20th. And that primary day is August 23rd. And it's really important that we get these gun sense school board candidates elected, progressive candidates elected, so that we can get this work done. So that's all.
Excellent. My apologies for messing up your name there.
No worries.
Okay. Closing remarks, action items, Connie and team.
Okay, so I think that I'm going to have 2 action items. One is just to reiterate what we've said here is the single most powerful thing you can do is be willing to have a conversation. So I would challenge everyone on the call here, when the topic comes up, don't shy away from it. Because again, you would be amazed at how many times we've had the conversation with someone, and I've been able to have somebody, go from very vehemently opposed to any idea of any gun safety laws to, yes, you're right, you have a point there. So please be willing to have the conversation and reach out to us. I mean, our group locally, we're on Facebook. We have an email. Scott, if you could drop all our contact information in the chat there. But if you ever feel the need, we do coffee talks. We have our regular meetings. Reach out to us. If you need a link or you need a reference or you need a statistic, we welcome the opportunity to give you that kind of information, because again, the most powerful thing you can do is be willing to talk about it. And follow us. There's lots of opportunities to do. Remember, we talked about shutting down the switchboard and getting that law passed at the national level. We can give you that too. We make it very, very easy to be able to send messages to your elected officials. Speaking of elected officials, my big action item here is this one. It's a website called gunsensevoter.org. And Scott will drop that in the chat too as well. You can go to this website and you just enter in your zip code or your street address. And what it will do is it will give you everybody on your ballot that has been granted the Gun Sense Candidate of Distinction for Moms Demand Action. In order to earn that Gun Sense Candidate of Distinction, those candidates have to fill out a very lengthy questionnaire. And that questionnaire goes to national level. It doesn't even come to us here locally. And they are screened and vetted at a national level and granted that Gun Sense Candidate of Distinction. They basically make a pledge that they will work to pass gun safety laws at the local level. And this year is the first year that the Gun Sense Candidate Distinction goes all the way down the ballot. So you will see school board candidates on there. You will see local city council members on there. You will see state representatives on there. You'll see our congressional representatives on there, all the way up to governor, all the way up to president, right? So if you believe that it's within our wheelhouse as a society to make our community safer, you've got to go take that to the ballot box, and you've got to vote for the Gun Sense candidates, because the time for shrugging our shoulders and just accepting that's the way life is over. We cannot accept the idea that we're going to live in a country where you're much more likely to die in a Walmart than you are in any other country in the world. So take it to the ballot box. So it's gunsensevoter.org. And as you're filling out your absentee ballot or your sample ballot before you go to vote, make sure you compare it against that and you make sure the people that you're voting for are gun sense candidates.
Thank you, Connie. I will say that speaking of safe, Scott did mention, do we have to have a safe to hold our guns in Florida? And that is in the chat room. I do want to emphasize because some folks don't have access to the chat or don't know how to access. And basically Scott's response is section 790.174 of the Florida statutes requires a loaded firearm in the home to be stored in a locked box container or secured with a trigger lock if the owner reasonably knows that a child under the age of 16 can gain access to that firearm. So that was just something I would definitely want to get out there for everyone. We need to discuss our September program, but before we do that, I just want to make sure I personally thank Connie and Scott and Jerry and MJ. And we usually kind of take it yourself. Well, we try to take ourselves off of mute and give ourselves an applause, but I'm not sure if we're able to do that today. Not sure what level. I think we have, we have 2 new messages here. Okay, there are more thank yous. All right. Any further remarks, comments? Can we, if Larry is still on, Larry, can you take a minute and talk about the September program for the Florida censorship? Do you feel comfortable with that?
Yeah, the program for September is Florida Censorship Obstructing Education. And we're going to be talking both at the public school level and the university level. So at the public school level, we have high school teacher Adam Tritt, who also has been working heavily on book banning presentations. And at the university level, we have an important professor. And we're going to have at both levels, well, at the high school level, we're going to have the deputy director of the union for
Vice President, Broad Federation of Teachers, Vanessa Skipper.
Yes. And we're not sure about who we're going to have at the university level on the union side, or if it's so. Anyway, yes, it's going to be a very important discussion of several things: book banning, intimidation of professors, and suppressing of history and sex education.
And that date is September 1st, Thursday, 6:30. And we'll start sending promotions out here within the next week or so. Thank you very much, Larry and team of technical folks that were doing this. We did give you the opportunity to unmute yourself or to take yourself off of mute so we could do a final clap for the team one more time. If you can do that, that'd be great. You should be able to take yourself off. I don't see those little red buttons going off on any of our things here. All right, let's have a. And what we do is we end our meeting. Is there anything that I've missed for tonight?
I don't think so.
Okay, so we should have our regular scheduled meeting in September, hosted by our local celebrity, Phil Stasek. So thank you all for joining us today. And if we could have the APC team stay on, and we'll do our quick critique of tonight. Make sure we get our our I's dotted and our T's crossed. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. You did great. We appreciate you.
All right. Thank you.